So Marty, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here. Marty had said to me that I should say something about semantics, or general semantics. Is there a difference between semantics and general semantics?
Let's all play together.
Anyway, so he sent me all this material, and you know, I'm just a kind of technology schlepper. So I have to admit, I read it and I didn't understand it, which probably doesn't make me a very worthy speaker. Probably I should be the one in the audience. So I'm going to struggle a little bit to talk about either semantics or general semantics. Maybe I should make a joke about, what, general semantics and lieutenant semantics? I'm sure you've heard that one before, right?
It'll be a major rarity.
But if there is a general semantics, I'm guessing it's Neil Postman, right? Who was, what was he, your founding something or other? I know Postman had spoken here, and Marty had told me that Postman was very influential in the general semantics movement. So I thought, rather than talking about general or semantics, which I don't understand, I would talk a little bit about Neil Postman that I do understand, or I think I understand, although I'm not sure I understand his writing on semantics. Postman was an extremely influential media thinker, perhaps the most influential of the last part of the 20th century. He was quite prescient, I think, in many ways. He foresaw the future in an unusual way. As much as anyone, perhaps, Orwell, Huxley, in that tradition of people who imagined the future before it happened. And he was outspoken, and I think he took positions that by definition were extremely unpopular but proved to be right. I think, as many of you perhaps are familiar with his work, his most acclaimed book, I think, was Amusing Ourselves to Death, which he wrote in 1984, which of course is a particularly important year, both in literal terms, but particularly in figurative terms, because it was the year that Orwell imagined when he wrote his famous book, 1984. He happened to write it in 1948. As a writer, most writers don't have much respect for other writers. I'm sure you know that. You know, we all think the others are terrible and boring, or we don't understand them. But I have to admit that the first 2 pages of Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death is really something that I've always, as a writer, tried to emulate, and I haven't, and I don't think I ever will, because it's so spectacularly memorable and relevant. And in a page, or maybe, I don't even, maybe in less than 2 pages, certainly a page or a page and a half, he summarized, I think, a lot of the thinking today of media thinkers like myself. I know Sherry Turkle, Alones Together, won the book award, Nicholas Carr, Jaron Lanier, Douglas Rushkoff. Some of you are familiar, they've spoken at your event, some of you are familiar with their books. So at the beginning of Amusing Ourselves to Death, written very consciously in 1984, Postman said, we got it wrong. We got the whole 20th century wrong, or certainly we got the last part of the 20th century wrong. Writing in 1984, he said, we expected in the last part of the 20th century, we expected Orwell, we expected Big Brother, we expected the dystopia that, sorry, am I popping here, John? Is it? Maybe I'm talking too close. Is that still all right? You can still hear me? We expected the dystopia to be Orwellian. We expected Big Brother. We expected cameras everywhere, but single cameras photographing us. We expected the totalitarianism that Orwell so brilliantly, so memorably warned us about in 1984. It was, of course, a vision, a dystopia that was predicated on a kind of amalgam of Nazism and Bolshevism, but particularly of Bolshevism, of Stalinism. And Big Brother, of course, was Joseph Stalin. Orwell, having fought in the Spanish Civil War, had been in his younger years a convinced socialist, and then having experienced the Spanish Civil War and seeing the nature of Bolshevism or Stalinism in the Soviet Union, suddenly recognized that this was the terrible threat, the absolute truth of Big Brother, of cameras everywhere, of totalitarianism. So Postman said, actually we got it wrong. The last part of the 20th century hasn't manifested itself in Orwellian terms, but rather in the other great dystopian novel of the 20th century, a book by Aldous Huxley called Brave New World. Now, there is a connection between Aldous Huxley and Orwell. Aldous Huxley had graduated from Oxford University, and as a young man, he went to teach at a school called Eton, which is a very famous school in England, the kind of, I don't know, what's the equivalent in the US? Philippus Exeter? Yeah, my ex-wife went there. That's why she's my ex-wife. And she went to Princeton, so quite an achievement. I have to tell her I came here. Anyway, Aldous Huxley was a terrible teacher, went to teach at Eton, and he taught Orwell. And apparently Orwell remembers Huxley, but as a particularly bad teacher, he was unable to keep discipline. Huxley was a bad teacher, and he was a rather eccentric man. He ended up in Arizona, and he had a whole sort of philosophy of alternative living, of drugs, of other kinds of consciousness. But his book, Brave New World, I think, in many ways is an even more prescient achievement, an even more profound warning about the future than 1984. In Brave New World, Huxley warned about a world of ignorance, a world of increasing inequality between a tiny elite, a tiny technocratic elite who flew their own planes, and an ignorant mob, an underclass, a proletariat, the disappearance of the middle class. There are similarities between Brave New World and 1984. It was a world of ignorance and propaganda, but 1984, Brave New World was a world without politics, a world without a single truth, a world defined by ignorance, kind of a surrealism of drug-taking, of alternative kinds of consciousness, what I guess today in the early part of the 20th century would be called virtual reality, a world where no one understood the nature of reality. Perhaps they should have read some general semantics. That's what general semantics, of course, in my understanding, is about, making sense of reality or identifying reality. So there was no general semantics in Brave New World. It was the opposite of that, whatever the word is. So Brave New World was one not of a evil political dictatorship, not of Big Brother, not of a single camera, but of a multitude of cameras which were perhaps turned around to focus on the self. And what Postman said in 1984 in this book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, is that Huxley was right and not Orwell. That the world was much more like Brave New World than 1984. Now, what's important to remember, which gives Postman his prescience, which makes, I think, Amusing Ourselves to Death so relevant, was that he was writing in 1984. He was writing before the internet became dominant. He was writing before network society. He was writing before Facebook and Google and Wikipedia and Yahoo and selfies. And in many ways, I think his critique was of television culture. In Amusing Ourselves to Death, Postman argued that we've forgotten about real civic virtue. We've become consumers of entertainment. We've forgotten the responsibilities of citizenship. We've forgotten what it means to really build a coherent community. in a funny kind of way, perhaps Postman was writing a prequel to Sherry Turkle's Alone Together. In amusing ourselves to death, as indeed in Brave New World, we are alone together. But he was writing it in 1984. In 1984, the internet barely existed. The first computer-to-computer communication happened in 1979 in UCLA on the West Coast. 1984 was 5 years before a young British physicist at CERN in Geneva invented the World Wide Web. It was certainly before the evolution or the emergence of the commercial web. So what Postman was imagining was the world of today without the technology of today. And I think it's important perhaps, and I think I'm guilty of this as some other technology critics have been, is that we have always treated the internet as representing a break with previous technologies, as being somehow different, as being, revolutionary, as changing the nature of things. Every generation always imagines the technology that they grow up with as being different, as being the thing in itself, as having no equivalent in history. But actually going back to Postman and his critique of television in 1984, in Amusing Ourselves to Death, should remind us that today's digital society and today's culture actually conforms to many of the same problems, many of the same weaknesses, many of the same critiques of television society. So if we'd have gone back to 1984, we were there now, the real 1984, not Orwell's 1984, there was a great deal of optimism, a feeling that things were changing about this new technology. Postman didn't, of course, think it, but there were many others who believed that this technology would indeed change everything. They believed this technology would change everything because its architecture was different from previous architectures. It was an architecture, the digital network, the digital revolution, which was in its early stages in 1984. It was an architecture which today we would call distributed. It was an architecture without a center. Ironically, or perhaps not so ironically, the digital revolution began in the 1940s and 50s and was sponsored by the Defense Department, by the CIA, by the Rand Corporation, all of whom were seeking to defend the American communication system against a Soviet attack. And there was a young man who came up with a brilliant idea for defending the American system, the communication system. The old system was a top-down system dominated by, of course, AT&T and the traditional telecommunications companies. But this young man, whose name was Paul Barron, and ironically enough, there was another young man in England called Davis, who was working along similar lines. They reinvented the idea of the communications architecture so that rather than having a top-down system, the communications architecture fragmented, that messages could be sent in so-called packets, many fragmented, thousands, tens of thousands, even millions of packets, so that it was protected from a nuclear attack. So the architecture of communications changed. It changed from a top-down system to one that was distributed, one without a center. And that's the technological foundations of the internet. That's what enables computer-to-computer communications. That's what enabled the first computer-to-computer communications in 1979 at UCLA. And that's the foundations of the World Wide Web. A place without a center, a place all edge, a place without the traditional hierarchies, the top-down hierarchies of traditional communications in the industrial age. That's, of course, why in 1984 there was a great deal of optimism about this new technology. Those in the know, and there were many, a guy called Len Kleinrock at UCLA, Tim Berners-Lee, of course, in Geneva, and many of the pioneers of digital revolution. There was a man called J.C.R. Licklider at MIT, who talked about the symbiosis of computers and man. They all had the same faith that this new architecture, this lack of a center, this democratized structure, which did away with the old top-down architecture of traditional communications, that this would enable a better world, that this would make things better, that it would democratize, that it would educate, that it would do away with the old elites, the Princeton clubs of the world, of course, the old media, the New York Times, the old television networks, the radio networks, that it would democratize culture, that it would create equal opportunity or rich opportunity for entrepreneurs, that it would enable more rights, give people more rights, give them more private realm. And of course, above all else, that it would do away with the inequalities of the old industrial world. That was the hope of the digital revolution back in the mid-'80s, and it was the one that was carried forth by web pioneers and idealists, utopians like Tim Berners-Lee, and many others with the emergence of the internet. More rights, more jobs, more equality, more culture, 4 things. Now, in my book, The Internet is Not the Answer, which was published this year, which I hope some of you will have the opportunity to read or have read, I say, okay, well, we've had almost 50 years of this thing now, since 1979, that's almost 50 years. 2019 will represent the 50th anniversary of this revolution. Has this revolution worked? Has there been the realization of more rights, more culture, more jobs, more opportunity? And in my book, I conclude that there hasn't. The book is titled The Internet is Not the Answer, and of course, and maybe a general semanticist would ask this, if the internet is not the answer, what's the question? The question, of course, is what should the operating system be for our 21st century? And at the moment, the internet is not the answer because it's not working, because it's not doing those things, because it's not creating more equality, because it's not creating jobs, because it's not enriching our culture, and because it's not giving us more rights. In fact, if anything, the reverse of all those things are true. So the internet currently isn't the answer, but I'm not here as a reactionary. I'm not here as a Luddite. I'm not telling you that we can go back to the certainties of the old age, back to the Princeton Club, back even to television, back to the analog age, back to the top-down nature of AT&T communications. We can't do that. So the internet has to become the answer, but it isn't. So let me lay out why it isn't. Let me go over those 4 things and explain what's gone wrong. And I think in all of them, Postman, with his warning in Amusing Ourselves to Death, and in much of his other work, in which he warned about a totalitarianism of technology or an authoritarianism of technology, where technology takes over. I think in many respects, Postman, of all the media thinkers of the last part of the 20th century, was the most prescient. The first reason why the internet is not the answer is because, and again, maybe you guys, this will resonate with you, it's premised on a logical error, fundamental logical error. It was always assumed by many of the technology pioneers that the architecture of technology shapes society. It's all too easy to see technology as the thing in itself, the first mover in a kind of Aristotelian way. It's all too easy to say, well, you have this technology and it will shape society, it will shape culture. But of course, technology comes out of culture. I'm from Northern California. One person you might have to speak at your event is Fred Turner, very distinguished Stanford historian of technology, who in an excellent book, From the Counterculture to Cyberspace, shows how the very values of the counterculture in Northern California were instilled in the technology which we use today. Technology then is never neutral. Technology wasn't delivered by a stork. in the middle of the night as a reward for our goodness, or for that matter, our badness. Many of the internet idealists think of the internet as this thing that was given to us, and that we have some sort of intrinsic right to it. Some of you may be familiar with the debates about network neutrality, for example. And you have young people out there screaming in the street saying, "Don't take our internet away." Well, of course, it was never their internet in the first place. So the notion of technology somehow just appearing is one of the great myths. And my book, in the first 2 chapters, focuses on the history of technology to show the very concrete foundations. Ironically enough, or as I said, perhaps not so ironically, it came out of the Defense Department. It came out of the state. So when you hear these libertarians in Silicon Valley now going on about the government always being the problem, you might just remind them that they never would have had the internet itself if it hadn't come from government funding. By the way, I haven't got a timer up here, so maybe you can tell me how much more time I have. 10 or 15, okay. I'll try and summarize my argument in 10 or 15 minutes. So, as I said, it's based on a logical mistake. It was assumed that this democratized architecture of the internet, the absence of a center, the doing away of the top-down structure, would result in a more democratized technocratic order. But the reality is actually quite the reverse. Since the invention of the internet, since its emergence as the dominant platform for commerce and above all else for media, since it's begun to revolutionize many other industries, from transportation through Uber, hospitality through Airbnb, education, healthcare, every industry now is being radically transformed by the digital revolution. This is the new industrial revolution. It's what 2 professors at MIT, Andrew McAfee and Eric Bryn Johnson, called the second machine age. This is the most profound shift, revolution, change in technology since the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. But we made the error of assuming that because the technology was somehow distributed, i.e. democratic, without a center, that the new world would be so too. But the reverse, ironically, is true. Perhaps, again, I don't know if this is a theory of general semantics, but there is a theory called the unintended consequence of things. And one of the ironic consequences of the internet is, for all its democratizing technology, its consequences have actually been the reverse. The iron law of digital society, of digital economics, is a winner-take-all scenario in which a tinier and tinier group of companies dominate this economy. The reality of this economy is of less competition, of the sweeping away of the old middle class. The reality of this economy is the disappearance, the vacuuming up, the hollowing out of the middle class. Now, that's not just a consequence of the digital revolution, but it's compounding those forces. The reality then of this revolution is of Google, for example. Increasingly a monopolist that controls more than 80% of search in America and more in Europe. Google, which of all the new mobile phones, 85% are sold on their platform. Google, a monopolist in YouTube. Google, a monopolist in mapping. Google, a monopolist in many different areas. Google, now the 3rd most powerful company in the world. 15 years ago, it was a garage startup by a couple of graduate students at Stanford. The same is true in every sector. You have a winner-take-all economy. Facebook in social, Uber in transportation, Airbnb in hospitality, Amazon in e-commerce. Now, we know that this was always the case. We had Microsoft in the bad old days, or what appeared to be the bad old days. But the reality is that these new companies are even more powerful, even more global. So the idea that this digital revolution would democratize our economics, would enable more entrepreneurs to have more success, is a delusion. Sure, anyone can do a startup. Sure, you can have an app company. But 99.9% of those entrepreneurs fail. And the only ones who succeed are the ones whose apps are bought by Facebook or Google. So we have a new kind of monopoly culture, a new kind of monopoly economy, perhaps a kind of monopoly capitalism 2.0, but one that is particularly troubling because of the power of these monopolists. And of course, because of the way in which they are reinventing the economy. Take Amazon, for example, which has introduced what you might think of as a digital Taylorism into the workplace. We all love Amazon, the books are cheap, they're always reliable, but the dark side of Amazon, as increasingly monopolist, is their exploitation of labor, their destruction of independent bookstores. Since the creation of Amazon, you have 50% fewer bookstores, and of Amazon as a monopolist in publishing, crushing small publishers. In a book by Brad Stone on Amazon, he reveals that Amazon executives thought of small publishers as gazelles. Guess who the big cat was? Certainly not the small publishers. So we see the appearance of an increasingly disturbing economy of huge, powerful global companies. Rather like Brave New World in a sense. Certainly not like 1984. These aren't totalitarian companies. These aren't companies with a single truth or a single leader. These are not companies that want to put people in jail or torture you or any of those other things. But they are nonetheless companies that are doing away with competition, that are reverse of this sort of democratized ideal. So what about employment? Maybe it's creating more jobs. Certainly has created some jobs. I've had many. I've lost them all, of course. And you can guess why, perhaps, having listened to me for a while. But the tragedy of the digital revolution is again, it's compounding our structural job crisis. Let me give you an example. In my book, I have 2 chapters, one on Kodak as the quintessential industrial company that employed 135,000 people, produced things, goods, products, which were then sold in stores, services, with its center in Rochester, New York, just upstate. 135,000 people worked for this giant industrial company. It wasn't an ideal company. It was in its own way exploitative, I guess, and was in its day a monopoly also. So I'm not idealizing Kodak. And at about the same time that Kodak went bust, when I went to visit while I was researching my book, a startup in Silicon Valley called Instagram sold to Facebook for $1 billion. The old and the new, the Kodak moment, the famous Kodak moment, was replaced by an equally famous or infamous Instagram moment. Now some of you will say, well, that's the nature of things. The great economist Schumpeter of capitalism always talked about the creative destruction of capitalism. No company or individual or idea has, of course, the right to exist forever. But there's a problem when it comes to jobs, a profound problem. Kodak employed 135,000 people, real jobs, union jobs, jobs that were properly paid, factory jobs, research jobs, service jobs. When Instagram sold to Facebook for $1 billion, which at the time seemed a lot of money, Instagram employed 15 people, 1-5. Imagine that, 1-5. Now, at the time, it was outrageous, it was shocking. But actually today, that doesn't even seem that shocking, because a year later, Facebook, flush with all your investors' cash, went out to make another acquisition. This time it spent a lot more than $1 billion. It spent $20 billion, which is really a lot of money, even in Silicon Valley, even to Mark Zuckerberg. And they bought a company called WhatsApp. Some of you may use it, a free service online. $20 billion. And how many people work for WhatsApp? 55. David Brooks at the time described it as the moral crisis of capitalism. Now, there are countless examples like this, and you might think to yourself, how is it possible that company could be worth $1 billion and only employ 15 people? Or how is it even more possible that a company employs 55 people and is worth $20 billion? The reason is because the nature of the digital economy has reshaped the idea of work, the idea of the factory. The value of Instagram wasn't in those 15 people, wasn't in the engineers who created the platform, which enables us to upload our photographs onto a network. The value of Instagram, the reason why Mark Zuckerberg wrote that check for $1 billion to Kevin Systrom, the founder and CEO of Instagram, was because all of us, maybe not all of you, but certainly your children and your grandchildren, people who put their content up for free. The value of these networks, whether it's Facebook, which is worth now hundreds of billions of dollars, or Google, which aggregated our intelligence to create search engines or aggregated our videos to create YouTube. The value of all these new companies is predicated on the free content that these companies create. That sounds bad enough, doesn't it? We're not getting the revenue back. That $1 billion didn't go to the people putting the content up on Instagram or the people using WhatsApp, or those of us who have added our logic to the Google search engine. It went to a tiny group of technologists. Work has changed. What has been created is what now is called, or what I call in my book, data factories. But these are different from the old industrial factories. These data factories are always open. We're always working in these factories, contributing our content, putting our content up. To quote Neil Postman, amusing ourselves to death. We are amusing ourselves with our photographs, with our posts, with our tweets, with our videos, with our music. And someone else is reaping the benefit. And the real jobs are going away. The only jobs are those of the technologists. Real value is going away. And of course, that crisis of jobs is only going to become more and more acute as we have intelligent machines, which are replacing labor, doctors, lawyers, accountants. And what we've seen also, which is even more troubling, is the reshaping of the nature of work. In the old days, Marx talked about a proletariat, a working class, which he at least argued was exploited by the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. Today we have a new class. In my book, I call it the precariat. People working precariously on these new platforms, driving Uber cabs, lending out their homes, their rooms on Airbnb, selling their labor on TaskRabbit. This new precariat, if they're lucky enough even to have those kind of gigs, are exploited on these new monopolistic platforms. Gets worse though. We had unemployment. We got inequality. What about rights? Now, in a sense, of course, rights are very attractive. We all have the right to use the internet to put our stuff up. In a sense, I guess, we've got digital rights. Tim Berners-Lee says there should be a charter of rights on the internet. I would strongly disagree. I think there needs to be a charter of responsibilities. But here's the real kicker, the really dark side of the internet. This is why I called my last book Digital Vertigo, as a remix of Hitchcock's Vertigo. That famous story of falling in love with the blonde that doesn't really exist, the blonde that turns out to be the brunette from Kansas. The real kicker is that we think we're in charge of this technology. We're putting our photos up, our posts, our tweets. We're using Google happily. It seems to be free. The old saying was there's no free lunch. Now people think there is a free lunch, or at least a free digital lunch. But of course, the reverse is true. These companies are enormously profitable, and yet they're giving away their products for free. How is that possible? How could Instagram be worth $1 billion or WhatsApp be worth $20 billion when they didn't even have a business model, when their stuff's for free? The reality, of course, is that all these new companies are big data companies. The more we use these products, the more we give away about ourselves, our movements, our identities, our thoughts, our preferences, what we're wearing, unfortunately all too often what we're not wearing. They know more and more about us, and they are packaging us up as the product. They are selling us. It's that old joke. It's not really that funny. If you're sitting around a poker table and you don't know who the full person is, it's you. And it's all of us in this new economy. We're the ones who are having our data mined. We're the ones who are having our privacy destroyed. We are losing our rights, that darkness, that essential darkness as human beings that drives our individuality, the very thing that Mill and so many other theorists of liberalism remarked is the driver of civilization. Big data then represents a surveillance economy. It's a new panopticon. We're on this network and we're being watched all the time, and it's going to get a lot worse. We're still at the beginning of this thing. With self-driving cars, surprise, surprise. Who's pioneering that? Google. Not because they want to save lives because of traffic accidents or solve the environmental crisis. Maybe those things are true about self-driving cars. But every time we get in a self-driving car that operates on a Google platform, they know where we are. Same is true of all these services. We have something called the Internet of Things. Might sound slightly science fictional to some of you, but it's a real thing. By 2020, Ericsson, the big telecommunications company, predict there'll be 50 billion intelligent devices. As Moore's law makes computer power more and more powerful, these devices will be in our clothing, in our walls, in our cities. You've all heard of smart cities. The reason why these cities will be so smart is because they know where we are. So we're on the brink of a new kind of totalitarianism, not a 1984 totalitarianism, but much more akin, I think, to Huxley's Brave New World. No single political dictatorship, but a commercial dictatorship of companies that seeks to mine us in order to sell us advertising. Because the reality of this free economy is all these companies are advertising companies. More than 90%, over 95% of Google and Facebook's business model is advertising, the selling of advertising. It's doing away with our intrinsic rights as individuals, as human beings. It's really troubling. Finally, we come to culture. Now, some people will say, oh, well, at least the internet gives everybody a voice. Now everyone can broadcast themselves. In the old world, in the old top-down architecture of old media, only a few media magnates determined who could say what. When you owned the printing press, only a few people could write editorials. When you owned the record labels or the movie studios, only a tiny group of people could determine what movies got made, what songs got made, what books, what articles got made. Today, of course, everyone is a journalist, everyone is a photographer, everyone is a singer, everyone is a videographer. Now anyone can put their videos up on YouTube. Now anyone can put their music up on SoundCloud or Spotify. Now anyone can blog. Now anyone can comment. Now anyone can tweet. Now anyone can put their stuff up on Facebook. So has this resulted in a cultural renaissance, a rebirth, a democratization? Are we living in a richer culture? And I'm afraid, again, the answer is no. The answer is particularly tragic for two reasons. The first reason is that this new digital revolution has decimated the old creative class. Since 1999, for example, when Napster emerged, we've seen a 50% drop in the revenue of the global recorded music industry. We've seen more and more closures of regional newspapers. We've seen the absolute decimation of professional photography. Some of you will have children. Some of you will have children who might want to become journalists. Anyone, with or without a knowledge of general semantics, would advise them not to, because there aren't any jobs. It's harder and harder to make a living. And one of the chapters in my book really focuses on this. The numbers are staggering. With this free content, people aren't buying newspapers. They're not paying for their music. Everything is for free. Again, as I suggested, it's not really free, but we see it as free. So we've seen this decimation of the old creative class. One particularly pessimistic journalist, an LA guy called Scott Timberg, has written a book called The Death of the Creative Class. Now, I wouldn't go that far. There are still professional creators. Ironically, though, what we have increasingly, instead of a more democratized professional cultural economy, we have a blockbuster economy. We have a tiny group of superstars who are more and more dominant, and we have, again, the hollowing out of the middle class. It's a persistent feature in this new world. The hollowing out of the cultural middle class, the hollowing out of the economic middle class, a tiny elite, a technological elite, an entertainment elite, and everyone else. Brave new world. Well, what about the idea that now everyone can comment, now everyone can tweet, now at least everyone has their own printing press and recording studio and movie studio? And I guess in a sense that's true. And it would be fair to say that there are stories of people who do have talent, who have used this new platform to pursue their own career. And that's a good thing. There are always stories. But it's rather like saying that if you want to justify the lottery, that you can point to somebody who wins the lottery. The reality of this new economy is that a tiny group of people are lottery winners, but everybody else is losers. And more than anything else, and I think this is where Postman is so prescient, that's why his amusing ourselves to death is such a great warning and such a great reference point. It's because, and this comes back to the award for Sherry Turkle's Alone Together, is that the reality of social media is a fragmentation. The reality of this new world is of isolation, of atomization, of anomie. Now, it's not just because of digital. It reflects changes in the broader economy. It reflects changes in the nature of work and how we live and more mobility and many other things. But the real tragedy at the heart of this new cultural economy is that we are literally amusing ourselves to death, not collectively, but individually. We're amusing ourselves to death in the sense that this new media has degenerated into a particularly vulgar form of narcissism. Now, Postman warned us about narcissism, and his fellow cultural critic, Christopher Lasch, in the 80s, also wrote a very powerful book about narcissism. Of course, the ancient Greeks were the people who invented the term narcissism, and this has been a feature which we have been, as human beings, I think, always prone to an excessive love of the self, an absurd love of ourself. But this new technology has taken this narcissism to new heights. Rather than listening to others, rather than using this technology to educate ourselves, what we are increasingly doing is using it to celebrate ourselves, celebrate our absurd love of ourselves. This has reached a particularly absurd climax in the cult of the selfie, where wherever we go, we photograph ourselves. I was on a plane today coming over from Vienna to New York, and there were a couple of young women in front of me, and they were perpetually snuggling up to one another and taking their photograph on an iPhone or some other device and then posting it on the network. Now, I don't understand why, but they weren't alone. Billions of selfies get posted every month. What we're seeing then is a degeneration of culture into this kind of narcissism. Sherry Turkle's Amusing Ourselves Alone Together is a very profound book in that area. She's researched it enormously. But it's also important to note that Postman predicted it. We did it in a sense with television. The bridge between television and the internet was reality television, reality TV. But today, we've lost that moral and cultural anchor. We go to museums, for example, and rather than staring at a Picasso or a Rembrandt or a Vermeer on the wall, we put ourselves between the picture and our camera, and we photograph ourselves in front of the work of art. So the degeneration of this culture into a kind of narcissism reflects the truthful cultural conclusion. So when you look at these four things, culture, rights, unemployment, equality, we're in a much worse position today than we were even in 1984 at the sort of the sunset of the television age. I think what I'll do is I'll finish there. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a final definition of where I'm at. I do have some solutions, but perhaps we can have some questions, and then I can come on to my solutions. So thank you. Is that...